In 1965, when the government at the center sought to make Hindi the sole official language for the Indian state, it was necessary for the DMK to seek election on the appeal that they would protect Tamil, that they would protect the language and identity of their electorate from the oppression of the majority. When Dalit students, such as Rohit Vermula, are compelled to kill themselves because their state and their university failed to protect them from discrimination and violence, when on average 3 Dalit women are raped in India every day, 2 Dalits are murdered every day, and 2 Dalit homes are burned every day due to unchecked casteism, it is essential for parties such as the BSP to seek election on the plank of protecting the Dalit identity. And when innocent Muslim civilians are slaughtered en masse by Hindu nationalists as their elected representatives turn a blind eye to the massacre, which happened in Bombay in 1992 and then again in Gujarat in 2002, we tell you that it is imperative for them to seek new political representatives who will fight for the protection of their identity. Ladies and gentlemen, our case today from side opposition is not about condoning communalism or fanning casteist hatred or dismantling secularism. Our case today is simple: minority protection. Over the course of my speech, I will talk to you about 3 constructive arguments. First, that it is legitimate to integrate identity with politics. Second, that appeals to identity are particularly important to minorities. And third, that appeals to identity are more dangerous when they occur outside the public eye. But before I get to those arguments, a few words on burdens. In spite of what government would have you believe today, the burden on side opposition today is not to defend and justify every form of an appeal to identity, to language, religion, or caste. There are, of course, detestable forms of such appeals that we are happy to curtail. For instance, in side opposition's world also, hate speech laws do exist, which means politicians are prevented from galvanizing their electorate through hostility and resentment against an identity. What side government has to defend, however, is the expanded interpretation of Section 123(3) of the Representation of Peoples Act, which was adopted by the Supreme Court in Abhiram Singh versus C.D. Komashan, that any and every reference to religion, language, caste, or race made by a political candidate ought to be prohibited irrespective of its context and purpose. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we oppose, which brings me to my first argument, that it is legitimate to integrate identity with politics. As human beings, we live in a world of constructed meanings. We attempt to make sense of our mortality by integrating our lives and legacies with structures that are larger and more permanent than ourselves, structures such as nationality, race, ethnicity, and religion. It is these identities that give our existence a purpose and a value. It is through these identities that we perceive our social realities. The desire of belongingness, of belonging to an identity and ensuring the preservation and perpetuation of that identity is therefore an essential feature of the human condition. For side government to then draw an artificial distinction between the identity and the interests of an individual is meaningless. All interests arise out of identity. Every policy, every law that the state enacts is about preserving and protecting an identity at a base level. Our economic policy, defense policy, criminal laws are all aimed at protecting India, a national identity. But as humans, we value identities other than just our national identity. We value more proximate identities, such as our religion or our language group. And as a consequence, it is perfectly legitimate for us to also desire the protection of these more proximate identities through state structures, which is why it is legitimate to integrate these identities with our political process. Side government argues that the use of identity in politics creates a less informed electorate, which is negative for Indian polity as a whole. We contest that. In a free democracy, individuals are at liberty to cast their vote on whatever grounds they consider to be important to themselves. Some of us may choose to vote based on economic and foreign policy of a candidate, but some may choose to vote based on a candidate's policy towards a particular religion or language because we prioritize that identity. That does not make the choice any less legitimate or any less informed than our own. Therefore, to ban any appeal or reference to such identities in our political system is to deprive our electorate of the ability to use a criteria that they value while determining how they should cast their vote, which creates a weaker and more vacuous democracy. However, The harmful impact of this move is not distributed proportionately in society, which brings me conveniently to my second argument, that appeals to identity are particularly important for minority communities, something that has been covered to a great deal by both sides. The problem with side government's case is that, according to them, when we stop appealing based on an identity, everything will suddenly be rainbows and unicorns, that we will come together, as a speaker said, 5 fingers in a fist. This presumes that the majority need these appeals in the first place to oppress the minorities, and once these appeals are taken away, even the majority cannot oppress the minority in the first place. We contest this fact. It is a fact that the interests of the majority will be preserved whether or not you allow appeals to identity for 3 reasons. First, because inevitably the majority will find greater representation in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, simply because of their greater numbers, and once there, will use these positions to further their interests. Second, because the majority constitutes the largest vote bank. Therefore, even when direct appeals to the majority identity are not allowed, you won't have members of the government taking steps that actively harm the majority identity, because that would ensure they don't get elected. And third, because a consequence of being the majority is that you also control a large portion of the wealth or capital in the nation, which you can then leverage to compel the government to heed to your interests. Thus, what we submit is that state structures will inevitably act in the interests of the majority identity. However, when this preservation of the majority identity crosses a line, when it becomes oppressive and antithetical to other identities, that's when you need these minority identities to collectivize under a common banner of Dalits, of Tamilians, of Muslims, to challenge the majority and protect themselves. This is rendered impossible without appeals to language, religion, or caste. The final argument I'll be making today is that appeals to identity are more dangerous when they occur outside the public eye. Because people in society place such tremendous value upon religious, caste, and language-based identities, and because voters often use these identities as shorthand for their political interests, we think it is unlikely that political parties will eschew appeals to such identities altogether in an election. The likely consequence of side government's argument is simply that the candidate himself no longer makes such appeals, but now such appeals are shifted to lower levels of the political machinery, to party workers and members of the youth wings, to streets and alleyways instead of rallies, behind closed doors instead of out in the public. 2 consequences arise out of shifting these appeals outside the public eye. First, you can no longer call them out as easily or punish them when they cross the lines of hate speech. And second, the speaker no longer has any incentive to moderate his rhetoric, which means the appeals get more radicalized and more full of hate. Therefore, communalism actually gets worse on their side of the house. Because identities are legitimate markers of political interests, because it is minorities who need appeals to these identities the most to counter oppression, and because these appeals become more radical when they occur outside the public eye, I am incredibly proud to oppose this motion. Thank you for your time.
Vanshaj argued that merely because I prioritize religion or language in carrying out my politics does not mean that those are illegitimate choices. In fact, what this does is that it creates a vacuous democracy, a weaker democracy if the motion stands. And it is inevitable that the majority will find greater representation, therefore necessitating representation.